Hello and welcome to the second of our end-of-week summary films for William Wordsworth, Poetry, People and Place. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Sally Bushell, who's my colleague from Lancaster University. So this week we've been focusing on Wordsworth's autobiographical masterpiece, The Prelude, and we've really enjoyed reading all your comments. So thank you very much for the engagement and participation in the course. It's been terrific. And thank you very much as well to Frank and Andrew, our two great mentors who've been guiding you on the way, learning things too, I'm sure. But there's a really nice sense of, as well as the community we were talking about last week, a sense of people sharing resources and links, which is lovely to see. So it's been a very exciting week. We've been into the Jerwood Centre again, and Jeff has shown us the various manuscripts of the Prelude. We've been to Hawkshead and looked into Wordsworth's schoolhouse. We've visited the banks of Ullswater and seen him row his boats there. You've had a chance to study the opening of the Prelude, to focus in detail on that boat stealing episode, and also to look at the Goslar letter. I think one of the really nice developments this week there's been a very strong sense of a sort of personal engagement with Wordsworth's poetry as well, with people undertaking some of the exercises, particularly the Padlet exercise, which has now produced a really nice mosaic of memories and images. There's a great image of someone there as a young child clutching a couple of daffodils, which we should perhaps take as the icon for this course in future years. But I want to turn now to talk to Sally and to discuss some of the topics that have come up this week and to get her ideas on things. First of all, Sally, there's been a lot of interest in your work as a manuscript scholar, both from last week and from this week. Only this morning, one of the participants was talking about how fascinating the sort of what she termed the detective work you undertake seemed to be. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the sort of the emotional and the intellectual rewards of manuscript scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's you're in a very privileged position, and I suppose, you know, from a negative point of view, quite an elitist position, that you're allowed access to these rare cultural treasures, and I guess that's one of the things that actually probably one of the things that got me into English literature in the first place. I remember going to the V&A when I was quite young, I don't know, early teenager, and seeing those manuscripts. I don't know if you've seen those, Simon. They have like the Brontes and Keats in those very old-fashioned wooden cases, and I do remember seeing those and just feeling that chart. Even then, when you don't have direct access, but still the charge of excitement, really, of that you know that Keats' hand did once touch that piece of paper, and you're actually seeing their handwriting. And of course, for us today, all of that's very unfashionable. Maybe non-scholarly readers wouldn't realise that, but the author is dead, and is not this sort of reified being that he once was. But I'm an old-fashioned critic, so for me, there's no question that the authoriality is really important to me. And to sit in the Jerwood Centre, or to be in Dove Cottage, as I was last week, where these people lived their lives and wrote these amazing, for me, amazing documents that I love, both in terms of content but also materially. So that, just to be able to touch the page and see the writing and the ink that person has written with at quite a basic human level, I just think is really exciting. Slightly bizarrely, what I found when I was doing the editing and spending a lot of time in the Dove Cottage was that I was also excited by things like, Jeff's got things like Helen Derbyshire's annotations of the editing of Wordsworth. So again, to other people, or to Selincourt, I found that really exciting as well, which obviously means I'm a very sad, nerdy Wordsworthian. But yes,
these are the great scholars of the past century, aren't they, Helen Derbyshire?
They are, yeah. And I think, again, for me and for you, I know, again, very unfashionably, our jobs are a kind of calling. I always feel it's kind of a vocation. I was meant to do this. And I think having that sort of sense of progression from the living author through the materials to these great editors of the past, and more humbly, I hope, myself in the present. That for me, that's just so important.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, as you say, it is a privilege for us, and we're very lucky to do what we're going to do. I mean, I think one of the great things about the new museum at Dove Cottage when it opens is that people will have unparalleled access to those manuscripts, and they'll be presented in a new way. So, hopefully, many members of this course will get a chance to see them for themselves. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, something that's fascinated people has been the whole process of revision, and a number of the learners on the course have commented, that how amazed they are that it might take 40 years for Wordsworth, to write this poem we've been looking at, and how that has surprised them because they expect a poem just to be sort of rattled off. And I just wondered if you could put Wordsworth in a sort of literary context for us. Is he pretty unusual in revising to this extent, or is this a standard process? Where is he on that sort of spectrum of revision?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's quite a broad question. I suppose attitudes, you've got two contexts. You've got a larger historical context, which would be sort of attitudes towards draft materials, and whether when you finish a text, that's it, it's done, or whether you see that text as an ongoing thing. I mean, that's a major division, and actually writers crudely, certainly in the past, do split into two camps. So and historically there's a split. So prior to the sort of mid 18th century, in general, it's like, this is the final version, throw away everything that came before, and that's partly because concepts of originality, imagination, creativity are not valued at that point in history. So you're not. I mean, obviously there were writers who did, but for the most part, you're not interested in how you got to where you got. You're only interested in the final product. And then with Romanticism, as we know, all of those things suddenly come to the fore. The self is valued, the imaginative process is valued, and so you see this shift from losing most materials to suddenly it's being retained. There's much more retention of materials, well, from the late 18th century onwards and 19th century. There's most archives in the world, a lot of those archives don't have very, very early materials, but they have lots of 19th century writers. So that's the larger historical question. I guess for Wordsworth, he is a kind of extreme example of the person who repeatedly returns his work, and obviously he's doing that at level of content as well as materially. So the great thing about Wordsworth, you always get these layers that I love of meaning, because he's all about the return to the past self, revisiting his own history, and materially he's also all about this endless return. So I guess I've always thought with Wordsworth particularly, it's like, as long as he's alive, anything could change, anything could be revisited. And of course, he lived a very long time compared to many other Romantic writers. So the Prelude is almost like, it's like a living textual self, I think. It's like an alter ego almost. And so it's never, as long as he's alive and he could return to it, he has the right to return to it. It's a living thing almost. Whereas other writers are much more sort of hard and fast about it. Once it's done, and they move on. Their lives move on. That's what's extraordinary with Wordsworth. He's living a totally different life from what he was, and totally different self from what he was in 1805, and yet he is able to return to that material. But of course, in part because of what I said earlier, because it's an act of return, it's almost validating that return to it.
Fantastic. That's a lovely phrase, I think, that sense of the living textual self. I've written that one down for future use. I'll credit you, of course. I mean, I think our learners have now got the sense that the Prelude exists in a number of different versions, the main ones being 1799, 1805, and then it's revised again in what gets published as the 1850 version. I mean, do you have some people have been asking about, which ones should they read and so on. Do you have a favourite version or recommendations for our learners on that?
I mean, Jonathan Wordsworth, who's now dead, who is a descendant and also a critic, he wrote an article that claimed there were 19 different versions of the Prelude. I actually think there's more than that, but we'll stick with that for now. And again, I think it changes over time. I think the first Prelude I came to was 1850 when I did A-level English. I remember it very clearly because I didn't get Wordsworth. It took me ages to get him at A-level. So that was initially the version I knew. Then I would say I have switched allegiance to 1805 because I do feel it's more free and truer, as it were, in some ways. So I say 1805, but having taught now the two-part Prelude, the earlier version, which isn't really a true text, but is treated as if it is a stable text, I think the two-part Prelude is a very good way in. I think it's a great way into Wordsworth, actually, into the Prelude. So I would recommend readers coming to it for the first time to go to the two-part Prelude.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I'd agree. I think with our own students, we often teach them the two-part Prelude now, don't we? Because it's difficult to get them to read a 13-book, meaning 13 sort of chapter poem, and lots of the early adventures that we've looked at are all there already in the two-book. But I mean, the main difference is for people who've not yet looked at the 1805 is that Wordsworth sort of takes his life beyond the age of 17, doesn't he, to his time at Cambridge. And then, most strikingly, for me as a sort of historical critic, to his time in France during the French Revolution. So those are the big developments. And that does sort of shift the centre of the Prelude, doesn't it? I mean, is the Prelude about growing up with nature, or is the Prelude about recovering from the trauma of being in the French Revolution? Those two versions have very different feel. So thank you. Another topic that our learners have been very interested in is this sense of the role of other people in Wordsworth's process of writing. And obviously lots of different dimensions to that, but Jeff last week, both in the end of week film and in the video, was talking about the role of Dorothy and Mary in terms of transcribing the works. And then of course Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge is a huge influence. I mean, do you have a view on how we should see William, who in old-fashioned terms would be seen as, the great writer, the great individual writer, wandering lonely as a cloud. Do you have a sense of how we should see him in relation to those other very important influences?
Yeah, I mean, again, I suppose it's a sort of late 20th century, early 21st century shift away from the author to view authorship as a collaborative act, and to say these writers, single writers, would be nothing without these other people, and so on. I think Wordsworth he does combine both those things. So he does very clearly go off and write alone. I mean, he does do that. That's not a total myth, and he, as we know because we visit them, has different sites around Grasmere that he really uses. That he'll basically say, sorry, I'm off, and go out all day and walk up and down and write there. So he does have a solitary mode. But I guess when you start to think about the stages of writing and production, then you might say, well, the first draft is very often solitary. He often does want to be alone to write that, I think. But then as the poem develops, as with all of us, you don't necessarily want anyone to read the first version of your great critical article. But once it's at a point where he's happy to share it, then he certainly does invite a lot of input and feedback from those around him. And so we've got examples of him reading aloud to Coleridge on New Year's Day, and lots of accounts of him reading to Dorothy. So definitely in those early years with Dorothy, he's often running it past her. So you could see that as quite a passive role in a way, but actually it's showing a lot of respect for her opinion and input, which he always does. And clearly she is very sensitive to his work, and feeding into it through her diaries and journals and so on, as we'll see later on in the course. So I think Dorothy is almost like a very strong sort of emotional and moral support to Wordsworth. She's totally attuned to him, totally. And of course, again, from our perspective, we see her as very subservient, and in some ways she is subservient. But she is happy in that role, and he gets a lot out of that. I think Mary has a very specific role. Once he marries Mary Hutchinson, she becomes Mary Wordsworth. She sort of seems to me, anyway, crudely, I haven't studied Dorothy and Mary that closely, but she seems more functional. So to me, Dorothy seems more emotional support very strongly, whereas Mary is always more functional. So he's often dictating to Mary. Mary's got very neat handwriting, so she's always writing the fair copies. So fairly or not, that's how I see it. So yes, clearly these women are very important to him at certain key stages. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it's probably worth acknowledging as well from William's point of view that he does acknowledge how indebted he is to them, doesn't he? So, you know, the Prelude, the end of the 1805 Prelude, there's a large passage of thanks to Dorothy for all that she's done for him. And of course, as we'll see in week 4 in Daffodils, I mean, he credits the, you know, 2 of the lines, which I think he might say are the 2 best lines in the poem. Mm-hmm. The idea actually came from Mary. So, you know, he does give credit where it's due.
Yeah.
I think it's very nice.
Oh, and Coleridge also, people were remarking, I think they were surprised that Coleridge had set the task of the recluse and so on. So Coleridge, so if Dorothy is sort of a positive emotional support, I say Coleridge is almost not exactly the inverse, but Coleridge is obviously the intellectual and the philosophical figure who's saying this is what you should be spending your time doing, and this is what is worth it. And so he's sort of measuring himself to Coleridge, but in a way, in a more problematic way. You know, Coleridge is often setting him tasks that Coleridge would like to be doing, but doesn't get round to. And then if William doesn't do it, Coleridge is a bit, you know, annoyed with him.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I mean, the sense of 2 different kinds of influences on his writing there sort of leads quite neatly into what I wanted to talk about next, which is the sense of Wordsworth's natural education as shaped by, as he says, beauty and by fear. Fair seed time had my soul, and I was fostered alike by beauty and by fear. And a lot of our participants have both been surprised, but then had some very interesting thoughts on the role of fear. So I thought I might say a little bit about that, as obviously I've been working on fear in Wordsworth recently, and then see if you want to come in. I mean, for me, the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things about that phrase, fostered alike by beauty and by fear, the first key word there, I think, is fostered. This notion that, you know, nature has taken on the parental role. You know, both Wordsworth's parents are dead by the time he's 13, I think. And so nature is going to educate him and help him develop. But then in talking about beauty and nature in terms of beauty and fear, and he's very much talking in terms of the 18th century categories of landscape, the beautiful and the sublime. And I think perhaps what's surprised some of our learners is that they expect to get the beautiful from Wordsworth because they're, you know, we all know Daffodils and so on, a very bright, joyful poem. But the notion of fear, the notion that landscape might inspire sort of fear that is powerful is more of a surprise. And I think there he's going back to the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke and his philosophical inquiry on our ideas of the sublime, the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. And so for him, fear is this notion of the sublime, the terrifying power in nature, but that it is a sort of an educating force too. And I mean, the surprising thing, perhaps in the Prelude, is that many of the spots of time, which we'll talk about in just a moment, hopefully, are these moments of fear, these moments of terror. And Wordsworth says that these moments are the most influential on his own life. And I just wanted to gloss that by reading a few lines from the 1805 Prelude, which our learners might find useful. So this is the later, the mid stage, if you like, the first complete version of the 1805 Prelude. And it's book 1. And if people want to look it up, if they've got their own copy, it's line 363. And Wordsworth says, I believe that nature, oftentimes, when she would frame a favoured being, from his earliest dawn of infancy, doth open out the clouds as at the touch of lightning, seeking him with gentlest visitations. So that's one form of influence on him. Nature's making this favoured being, which is what Wordsworth is, you know, the great poet he's become. And one way which nature acts on you is through the gentle visitations. And then he goes on to say, not the less, though happily, perhaps aiming at the self-same end, does it delight us sometimes to employ severer interventions, ministry more palpable, and so she dealt with me. So there we've got this sense of nature, in this case feminized again, as being these stronger interventions, these more forceful, scary interventions. And then in this version, he's off into the rowing boat episode, the stealing of the boat episode, which our learners now know very well. So there's this interesting doubleness to nature, I think, in Wordsworth. And one of the things I've been doing in my own work recently, because I've been working on the writing of mountaineering, is just looking at how important fear is for Wordsworth as a force that leads to these unprecedented states of being, these new ways of sort of thinking, which the spots of time often take him to.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you're sort of saying there's a doubled response to nature in beauty and fear, but then the sublime is doubled within itself as well. So that sense of what in the boat stealing scene he describes an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. And I thought that's a great way to describe it, the sublime, because that's effectively what it is, troubled pleasure or pleasurable pain, isn't it? You know, so so that's what makes the sublime interesting, is this sort of merging of two things that you wouldn't expect. You know, it's both beautiful and terrifying. And I guess, you know, that's your point about trying to achieve a sort of heightened state. You know, the romantics do that in various ways, natural and drug induced. And that's what the sublime is, a sort of that natural high, isn't it? And so that adrenaline rush, when you feel that the thrill of fear, you'll never get that with beauty. You'll only have a, you know, you'll only have an untroubled response to beauty. But it's that the thrill and the charge that makes the sublime so attractive.
I mean, one of the interesting things there, I think, is Wordsworth is able to, he can kind of handle the thrill, can't he? Though it takes him to new places.
Yes.
In a way, the Prelude is all about, handling the thrill. Coleridge kind of can't handle the thrill.
Yeah.
I mean, Coleridge actually, you know, he himself says he becomes addicted to two things. He becomes addicted to mountain climbing because of the thrill, and that brings him close to death at one point in a famous descent of Broad Stand on Scarf Hill. He then becomes addicted to opium, you know, and so very different responses to the sublime from these two sort of great friends and great poets of the sublime. The final thing I wanted to ask you about, if that's okay, is to pick up on what you've just said, and this is the sense of guilt that seems to underpin the spots of time more generally. I mean, and again, I think a number of our participants have been surprised by this, and one of our commenters had a great phrase when they were talking about Wordsworth's early years of crime. And I think they're right in that so many of these spots of time involve a transgression, don't they? Stealing a boat, or climbing a cliff face when it's dangerous to do, or stealing somebody else's snares. And I guess what for me is so powerful about the spots of time is this sense of they're so strange, they're so dark, they involve these difficult, you know, moments of troubled pleasure, as you say, but certainly involve that sense of a kind of transgression.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, well, they are dark, but they still have that flip side, don't they? So they're often, you know, very calm. You know, the first one is very calm and still. So there's a sort of what appears to be on one level again on the surface, you know, a beautiful lake, and then bam, there's a dead body popping up out of it. You know, that kind of. So it's that very, you know, quite bizarre juxtaposition of two states, and that's often the case. There's this sort of an underlying. There's either something beautiful that's disrupted, or an underlying fear that is sort of crystallized. So like the gibbet, where you're in a very scary place that you're probably going to have nightmares about, and then you see this very symbolic visual icon. So it's often sort of doing two things at the same time. And I think a lot of that, again, if we draw on our own experience of spots of time, you know, you have these very early moments, and for Wordsworth, he says that from the earliest moments in our childhood. So that was a point I was making in the chat with someone or in the comments, that the point about the spots is that I think anyway, argument, but that they're very early memory, where you don't have a continuous memory. So this is the point. They're sort of little sort of glimpses through the cloud, as it were, and they're just held there, and you don't actually even know why they're held there. And this is true for all of us. You know, you have these early memories that are just like a little scene or a visual, often just visual. That's all that remains. And there's a charge. There was something there, something caused you to remember it. Now, often probably what caused you to remember it was something bad. You know, it probably was that your parents slapped you, or you know, you cried, or something you hurt yourself, and that's why you remember it. But now you don't have that charge. And I remember, I think in one of the draft passages of the further spots of time, when he's trying to describe what they are, very interesting. He says that he calls them the hiding places of my power. Again, fantastic phrase, you know. And that's his point. It's like you can't quite get at it. You don't quite know why you remembered it. You don't quite know what it stands for. And for Wordsworth, you don't have to explain everything, do you? You know, they're weird and disturbing, and you don't quite know what's going on, and that's what's good about them in a way, you know.
I agree, absolutely. I mean, that's one of his most powerful passages, I think, for me, are those ones where he's on the edge of comprehension and on the edge of language.
Yeah.
You know, the rowing boat incident finishes with him saying something like, you know, that state of mind where it's a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. So that everything is a negative. It's either dark or it's unknown. And that, for me, that's a lot of Wordsworth's power is he asks what he himself terms obstinate questions.
Yeah.
You know, he explores these states that are very much on, as I say, on the border of experience, and possibly isn't able to explain them, which is one of the things why I think we continue to find them fascinating and engaging. But as you say, also because they echo our own experiences too.
Yeah, and I also think that that's something about Wordsworth, that people who don't know, haven't really read him, or haven't, you know, have an idea of him, it counters what you expect. Because what I really like about Wordsworth, and it frustrates me as a Wordsworthian, is he is willing to say, I don't know what it is, I don't understand it, I want to get it. You know, he's willing to allow doubt and uncertainty right through a text to the final version, and that's very, very unusual. You know, he doesn't try to pin it down, and that's something that I find really attractive about him, because he's actually very open in the way he tries to express the human condition. Whereas I think that's totally counter to what people think Wordsworth is. They think he's very strict and rigid and fixed, and he's not at all. He's so full of self-doubt and willing to articulate it.
Yeah, I think you capture there as well that this sense that Wordsworth is doing very new things. You know, he is an adventurer, isn't he? He's a kind of adventurer out in the lakes and you know, in the fields. But he's also an adventurer in his own mind. He's trying to explore new terrain, both external terrain and internal terrain, mental terrain. Yeah,
and there's a sort of courage about that, I think, to me. Anyway, as a poet, there's a courage about his poetry I like.
Great. Well, I think as learners will be gathering, we both feel very passionately about Wordsworth's poetry. So, you know, we do hope that you come to share some of our passion for him. So, thank you very much indeed, Sally. I know how busy you are, so we very much appreciate you spending this time with us. Hopefully, you'll be able to join us again this sort of time next week, and we're hoping Jeff can join us again. So, next week, then, learners, we will be visiting Grasmere. We're going to what Wordsworth describes, I think, as the tumultuous brook of Greenhead Gill, which is a waterfall or river up behind Grasmere, and it's the setting for William Wordsworth's fantastic poem Michael, story of a shepherd from Lyrical Ballads. So thank you again for all your engagement this week. Thank you to Frank and to Andrew. Thanks to the ISS guys who help us out on the course. Thanks very much to Sally, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week.